Put him down. You're not his mother." The voice cut through the quiet like a whip. Alina froze where she knelt on the carpet, her arms still outstretched toward the little boy in front of her. Ethan, wobbling on his small legs, startled at the sharp tone and dropped to the floor with a soft thud. His wide eyes flicked between his father and the maid. The fragile attempt at balance shattered in an instant. David Hale stood in the doorway, his tall frame stiff against the glow of the chandelier, his eyes, grey and cold, locked on Alina as if she had trespassed into forbidden territory. He had just come home from another long day at Hale Technologies, but instead of relief, his return was met with this unexpected scene. His son leaning toward the housemaid, as if she were his lifeline. Alina lowered her gaze, heat flushing her cheeks. She hadn't meant to cross any boundaries. She had only been sweeping the hallway when Ethan started pulling himself up on the couch. Instinct had pulled her down to his level, hands extended, voice gentle, whispering encouragement. She had seen the spark of determination in his eyes and simply couldn't ignore it. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hale," she said quietly, her accent softening the words. "He was trying. I thought maybe you thought wrong." David's reply was sharper than he intended, but he didn't stop himself. He crossed into the room, his polished shoes tapping against the marble floor. "You are here to clean. That's it. My son's care is not your responsibility." Alina nodded quickly, retreating, her hands fumbling with the hem of her apron. Ethan pressed closer to her leg, sensing her discomfort. He didn't cry, he rarely did, but his small fingers curled around the fabric of her uniform as though clinging to her presence. David noticed, and it twisted something in his chest. He forced his expression to harden further. "Let go of her, Ethan," he ordered, his voice low, commanding. But Ethan didn't move. He simply stayed where he was, small and silent, holding on to the only person in the room who had reached for him. For a moment, the silence between father, son, and maid became unbearable. The house, with all its grand chandeliers and polished wood, seemed emptier than ever. Alina finally pried Ethan's hand gently from her apron and stepped back. "I'll get back to work," she whispered. She disappeared down the hall, leaving father and son in a room filled with unspoken tension. David exhaled, pressing his fingers against his temples. He hadn't meant for his words to sound so cruel. But the image of his son stumbling toward someone else had pierced him deeper than he could admit. Ethan had never leaned toward him that way. Not once in 4 years. "Come here, son," David tried, his tone quieter. Ethan looked at him, but didn't move. His eyes, wide and distant, drifted back toward the hall where Alina had gone. David clenched his jaw. Not again, he thought. 7 nannies had come and gone in less than a year. Each one promised progress, each one left with frustration. And now, this maid, this woman he barely knew, had managed to draw from Ethan what professionals could not. He turned away, loosening his tie as if to strangle the thought before it grew. Yet the image replayed itself in his mind, Ethan standing, teetering, moving forward not because of him, but because of her. Later that evening, the house was draped in the quiet David both craved and despised. He poured himself a drink in the study, staring at the amber liquid as if it held answers. The rain tapped softly against the tall windows. The door creaked open slightly, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Grant, stepped in. She had worked for the Hale family for over a decade, long before Claire's illness, long before the walls of this mansion had closed in around them. "You came home early tonight," she observed gently. David didn't look up. "And I regret it." Mrs. Grant raised a brow. Because you caught a maid trying to help your son take a step. He shot her a sharp look, but she didn't flinch. Age and loyalty had earned her a freedom others didn't have. I don't need her confusing him, David said, his voice rough. He's fragile. He needs structure, not false hope. What he needs, Mrs. Grant replied softly, is someone willing to kneel on the floor with him. Her words hung in the air. For a moment, David's throat tightened, but pride forced him to dismiss her. That will be all. She nodded and left, but not before glancing back at him, her eyes heavy with something between sorrow and reproach. Across the hall, Alina sat alone in the small room assigned to her. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and her heart still pounded from the confrontation. She replayed his words over and over. "You're not his mother," she whispered to herself in Spanish. The comfort of her first language wrapping around her like a shield. He doesn't know, he doesn't understand. Her thoughts drifted to her younger brother, to the countless times she had knelt on the floor beside him, coaxing him to take a step, to say a word, to simply look at her. She remembered the small victories, the first time he reached for her hand, the day he laughed at a silly tune. None of it came quickly, none of it came easy, but every moment had mattered. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply. Ethan deserved the same patience, even if his father didn't see it yet. The next morning, David found himself lingering at the breakfast table longer than usual. He wasn't reading the news, nor was he scanning business reports. His eyes kept drifting toward the living room, where Ethan sat on the floor, blocks scattered around him. Alina passed through quietly, carrying a basket of laundry. She didn't look his way, didn't greet him, but Ethan's gaze followed her as she crossed the room, and then, almost imperceptibly, Ethan picked up a block and placed it in her path. As though wanting her to notice him, David's chest tightened again. He watched as Alina crouched, picked up the block, and handed it back with a smile so gentle it softened even the cold morning light. "Gracias, Ethan," she said softly. The boy blinked, clutching the block to his chest. Something stirred in David, a mix of jealousy, admiration, and fear. He wanted to believe progress was possible, but if progress came only when Alina was near, what did that say about him as a father? He gripped his coffee cup, the porcelain burning against his palm, and whispered under his breath words no one else could hear. "Claire, what am I supposed to do?" The house stayed silent, but somewhere in the distance, Ethan laughed, not a loud laugh, but a faint, broken sound, almost like the crack of light under a locked door, and David, against his will, turned his head toward it. By noon the house had returned to its practiced quiet, and David pretended to like it that way. He moved through rooms that smelled faintly of lemon oil and fresh flowers, a museum curated for a life that had wandered off. From the breakfast table he could see Ethan on the rug with a scattered rainbow of blocks. From the hallway he could hear Elena's footsteps that somehow never knocked anything over. Mrs. Grant set a plain white mug in front of him. "You didn't touch your first cup. I don't drink second chances," he said, then caught himself. "Thank you." She folded her hands, a posture that had seen him through IPOs and funerals. "If may I say, sir, structure is useful, but structure isn't love. I've given him everything structure can buy." "A schedule," she replied. "What he needs is someone who arrives without a clock." He stared into the coffee, heat fogging the surface. "And you think the maid is that someone?" "I think a child is showing you his vote," she said softly. "The rest is pride and paperwork." He almost smiled, a flicker he buried with a shake of his head. "I have a call." He didn't, but leaving felt easier than listening. In the glass tower of Hale Technologies, the city laid itself at his feet like a map. The boardroom glowed with screens and certainty. Talk circled margins, market share, and new wearable numbers that behaved when pressed. "Your head's not in the room," said Michael Chen, his COO, and one of the few people who had earned the right to be blunt. "Contrary to legend, my head exists in multiple rooms," David replied. Michael studied him, then lowered his voice. "The market will forgive a stumble. A child won't." "Don't," David snapped, the word thrown like a doorstop. "Not you." Michael didn't retreat. "You hired 7 nannies, like you hire consultants. Children don't pivot because a calendar changed." "Enough." David pushed back his chair. "Meeting's over." It wasn't, not really. But the room obeyed him anyway, the only gospel he still believed in. In the elevator down to the garage, a memory rose on its own. Claire in a hospital room that smelled like citrus and courage, her head wrapped in a scarf she hated and wore for him. She had taken his hand with that smile who always found a way to keep its promise. "If our son never measures up to a chart," she'd whispered, "promise me you won't treat him like a race." "I don't know how to help him." "Patience will say what you can't," she said. "And when you don't know what to say, kneel." The elevator chimed. The doors opened. The present rushed back like cold air. When he returned home, the afternoon had softened. Ethan lined up 3 blocks in a row, then knocked them down and flinched from the sound he himself had made. Alina, across the room, folded laundry with the careful attention of someone mending something that wasn't cloth. On the coffee table lay a series of simple picture cards drawings of a cup, a ball, a bath, a bed laminated, labeled. It looked like order made gentle. "What's this?" David asked. Elena straightened. "A picture schedule. If he can see the next thing, sometimes the next thing feels less like a cliff." "Who told you to do that?" "No one," she said, aware she was stepping onto the thin ice of his tolerance. "Therapists build the plan. Home builds the heart." He glanced at the cards, at the straight edges that had only one intention. "I'm not opposed to tools," he managed. Her smile was almost not a smile, more like the quiet relief of a wound that had stopped stinging. "Side by side, often. Works better than face to face," she added carefully. "With him, with a ball." He picked one up from the floor, an orange foam sphere, no heavier than a thought. "If he doesn't look at you, he can still see you," she said. "It's less pressure, more invitation." He moved to the rug, the gesture so foreign he felt ridiculous in his own home. He sat shoulder to shoulder with his son, not in front close enough for warmth, far enough for choice. He rocked the ball in his palm and set it between them. It rolled until it touched Ethan's knee and then stopped. Waiting like a friend who knows your doorbell, Ethan's fingers hovered, then closed. He turned the ball, explored its give, pressed it to his cheek, and without looking nudged it back. The soft thump against David's palm was barely a sound, but it landed like a bell. David swallowed. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, as if words could shatter the moment's glass. He rolled it softly again. For a long minute the rhythm held, palm to knee to palm. The smallest bridge built. Elena didn't speak. She stood in the doorway and watched father and son share something measured not in miles but in breaths. She turned away first, because victories like this belong to the people inside them. When the ball slipped from Ethan's hand and bumped against David's shoe, a laugh caught in David's throat before he strangled it back. He exhaled, long and slow, and set the ball on the table like a kept promise. "Thank you," he said to the room more than to the woman. Then, remembering himself, he straightened. "But don't overstep again." "Yes, Mr. Hale," she replied, but her eyes were clear. She had heard the part that mattered. At dinner, David ate alone at a table that could seat 20. He read an email from a pediatric clinic about an opening with an occupational therapist, something Mrs. Grant had put on his calendar weeks ago. He replied with a single word, "Confirm." He paused, then added, "Please ask if we can observe one session." It felt like handing the steering wheel to a stranger. It felt like admitting the car was real. Outside, clouds gathered themselves into a color that warned of rain. The wind pressed its palm against the windows. He checked on Ethan. He was stacking cups near the fireplace, concentration stitched into his brow. Alina set a weighted blanket near the couch without comment, a small thing that made the room look less like a showroom and more like a refuge. "Why the extra blanket?" he asked, purely to keep his voice from calcifying. "Sometimes the body needs to feel held before the heart says yes," she said. "Wait is a kind of yes." He nodded, as if he had known that all his life. "Do you?" the question surprised him, rising like a bubble. "Do you sing to him?" "A little," she admitted, wary now. "Only when he can't find the off switch for fear." "What do you sing?" "Something simple," she said. "The words don't matter as much as the steadiness. Fear listens for steadiness." He wanted to mock the poetry, to pin it to the corkboard of logic, but the day had worn down his appetite for armor. "Don't do it tonight," he said, and hated himself for the command even as it left his mouth. "I mean not unless he needs it," she finished. "I know." He looked at her for a heartbeat too long. "I'm not the villain you think I am." "I don't think you're a villain," Elena answered. "I think you're a father who is afraid of being replaced. But love doesn't replace. It multiplies." He felt the truth land where truths go when they can't be argued. "You talk like my wife did," he said before he could stop it. Elena lowered her eyes. "Then I hope you keep listening." He retreated to his study and opened a drawer he rarely used. A small pair of baby shoes sat there, white leather smudged with a time that hadn't happened. He had bought them the week Claire said, "He'll run one day, David. It might not look like running to anyone else, but we'll know." He put the shoes back. He closed the drawer. He looked at his hands and tried to recognize them. In the hallway, he heard the soft slide of Elena's steps and the almost not sound of Ethan breathing near sleep. He stood and walked toward the nursery, careful as if the floor held thin ice. From the doorway, he watched Alina tuck the weighted blanket over Ethan's small body. She didn't sing. She didn't touch his hair. She simply sat on the floor beside the crib at a distance that said, "I am here," and a silence that said, "I'm not going anywhere." Ethan's eyes tracked the shadow of her shoulder against the wall. His fingertips tapped a private pattern only he understood. His breaths lengthened. The room rearranged itself around the possibility of rest. Alina glanced at the door and caught David watching. Neither spoke. Their eyes met on the shared ground of a promise neither had made out loud. On the far side of the glass, the sky rumbled like a memory. The lights flickered once, then held. Elena's gaze drifted upward, measuring the storm by ear. David stepped back into the hallway, the air cooled by a weather that did not ask permission. Some houses go quiet before they learn to breathe. On that evening, the Hale house held its breath, and outside, The first drop of rain found the window. The storm arrived. Without warning, one moment the whole mansion glowed with its usual sterile brightness. The next it was swallowed whole by blackness. The sudden crack of thunder rattled the windows, and from the nursery came a sound David feared more than any market collapse or boardroom revolt, his son's scream, "Daddy, Daddy." It wasn't words Ethan rarely formed them. It was raw sound, high and piercing, born of panic. David rushed to the doorframe, his hand gripping the molding so hard the wood bit into his skin. Inside, Ethan thrashed in his crib, his small hands clawing at the air, body trembling as the unfamiliar dark wrapped around him. "Ethan," David whispered, but his voice sounded like a stranger's even to himself. His feet refused to move. His body froze, paralyzed by a terror he had no name for. He wanted to hold his son, to gather him close, to shield him from the storm. But he couldn't. His chest locked, his breath stuck. A faint flicker of light drew his eyes. Alina entered the nursery, calm where he was not. In one hand she held a lighter. In the other, a candle she had pulled from the hallway. She didn't speak to David, didn't even look at the doorway. Her attention was fixed entirely on the boy. "It's all right, mi cielo," she murmured in Spanish. Her voice low and steady, the sound itself a kind of anchor. "My sky, my heaven," she lit. The candle, set it on the dresser, then quickly found another. The warm glow chased the shadows from the corners, softening the jagged edges of the storm outside. Ethan's cries faltered for a moment, though his chest still heaved. His small fists opened and closed like shutters fighting against wind. Alina lifted him gently from the crib. "You're safe. You're safe with me." Her arms wrapped around him, not tight, just steady, her hand resting at the back of his head. Then, softly, she began to sing. The lullaby was unfamiliar, a Spanish melody with no translation David could follow. The words curved like water, flowing slow and patient, not rushing to fix, but willing to wait. The sound filled the nursery, not grand, not trained, but real. Ethan's body jerked once, twice, then sagged slightly against her shoulder. The rhythm of his screams thinned into uneven sobs. His breaths, ragged at first, began to stretch, each one a little longer, a little calmer. David's throat tightened. He pressed his palm against the doorframe to steady himself. "My son finds safety in a stranger, and I'm invisible." He wanted to step inside, to thank her, to demand she hand Ethan to him, to prove to himself, to Claire's memory, to the universe that he could be enough. But his legs refused, bound by the invisible rope of pride and fear. She, Ethan, Alina whispered between verses, "Listen, just listen." Her song continued, steady as candlelight. Ethan's fists unclenched, his head dropping into the crook of her neck. The storm outside still raged, but in the room it sounded further away. David's breath caught when he noticed it. Ethan's shoulders no longer shook with each gasp. His body, though not fully calm, was quieter than before. For weeks, for months. He had been a child trapped in chaos. Tonight, in the arms of someone who wasn't even supposed to be part of his story, he found a moment of stillness. The candlelight wavered across Elena's profile. Her eyes were half closed, her lips moving. With the lullaby, her entire being wrapped in patience. She had no idea she was being watched. That, perhaps, was what made it unbearable for David. "Why not me?" He whispered, the words lost beneath thunder. Why not his father? He saw it as clearly as if it were written on the wall. His wife's absence, his own failures, the coldness that had grown between him and the boy. And here was Alina, a maid, a woman he had dismissed as ordinary, holding the one thing he could not hold: Ethan's trust. Ethan gave a soft whimper, then, almost miraculously, no sound at all. His tiny chest rose and fell in a fragile rhythm. He was not asleep, not yet, but he was on the fragile edge of it. Alina continued to hum, her voice a thread tying him to safety. Her sway was unhurried, the kind of movement that said, "I will not leave until you're ready." David leaned his forehead against the doorframe, shame pressing down heavier than the storm. His jealousy burned sharp, but beneath it was something worse: gratitude. Gratitude that he couldn't show, because to show it would mean admitting he wasn't enough. The song wound on, each note simple, unadorned. It was not music for an audience. It was a bridge, built in the dark, strong enough for a frightened child to cross. Minutes passed. The thunder softened into distant grumbles. Candlelight trembled over the room's white walls, throwing shadows that looked almost like comfort. David lifted his head, his eyes tracing the small boy now calmer in her arms, then the woman holding him as if the storm had no power here. For one reckless moment, he imagined walking in, reaching out, letting himself belong in that fragile circle of light. But he didn't. His pride, his fear, his grief, all the chains that had held him since Claire's death, pulled him back. Without a sound, David stepped away from the door. His footsteps carried him down the hall, the glow of the nursery shrinking. Behind him, he did not join them, but as he moved through the darkness of his own house, one thought followed him like a candle he dared not hold. I longed to. He almost missed it. A corner of glossy paper caught the light as Alina bent to dust the baseboards, a small rectangle peeking from the mouth of a canvas tote she kept by the hall console. David paused on his way past, a stack of contracts under his arm. On the photos, edge, two figures blurred by motion, one taller, one smaller, hands touching in mid-air, as if finishing a secret. Handshake. Alina straightened and noticed where he was looking. She nudged the tote gently with her foot, tucking the photo back into shadow. "Sorry," she said, soft and even. "I'll keep my things out of the walkway." "It's fine," he replied, too quickly. "Just don't leave anything on the stairs." He continued toward his study, but the image walked with him: two figures. A feeling of bond, like a song he knew but couldn't place the lyrics to. By late morning, an occupational therapist arrived for a home session. The Hale mansion, which had learned to wear silence like a silk scarf, changed its texture in subtle ways, laminated visuals on the coffee table. A small trampoline rolled out near the window, a weighted lap pad folded like a promise. The therapist, a woman in her 30s, with kind eyes and practical shoes, spoke quietly and praised often. Alina hovered at a respectful distance, mirroring strategies without ever stealing the lead. David observed from the doorway as Ethan pressed his hands into putty, pushing, pulling, discovering resistance. The therapist narrated each success like a play-by-play in a game that only mattered to 3 people in the world. "That's it, Ethan. Push and pause. Push and pause." When Ethan startled at the sound of the wind against the glass, a hand lifted, then stayed just short of his shoulder. "I'm here," she told him without touching, a lesson in consent wrapped in care. He glanced her way, breath stuttering, then steadied. A small progress, invisible to a noisy world, bright as a flare to those who loved him. David felt something loosen in his chest. These were not miracles, but they were real. As the therapist packed up, she smiled at David. He's responding to predictability, she said, and to patience. I'm learning patience isn't a feature I can download, he muttered. It's a practice, she said. The good news, practice works. Alina saw his mouth twitch almost a smile and pretended not to. Late afternoon, David passed the laundry room and heard the spin cycle sigh to a stop. Alina had stepped out to fetch linens from the guest wing, leaving a basket on the counter. A notebook lay open beside it, a page of block schedules, snack ideas, and 3 simple Spanish phrases printed in neat letters. Mira and escuchen. Respira and look and listen. Breathe he meant only to return a sweater he'd found on the staircase banister. But when he set it down, his elbow nudged the notebook. Something thin slipped free from between the pages and slid to the tile. The photo. He crouched, guilt prickling his neck, and picked it up. A much younger Alina beamed at the camera in a sunlit park. Next to her stood a boy a few years younger. His shoulders rounded slightly, his gaze not the camera's but to the side, as if listening to a rhythm no one else could hear. His hands were clasped in front of him, fingers twisting in a way David knew now by heart. On the back, in blue ink, 2 words, Mi hermano, my brother. The recognition hit him like a soft collision. Not pity, not charity history. The patience he'd seen wasn't borrowed from a book. It had been forged in the long, ordinary hours of living beside an alternative map. He set the photo back between the notebook's pages, careful to leave the room undisturbed. Careful, also, to admit to himself what the image said out loud. She wasn't guessing. She had learned a dialect of love he was only beginning to hear at sunset. He did a thing he had not done since Claire left, a silence no engineer could fix. He asked someone to sit. Tea, he said, awkward in his own kitchen, as if the word were a language he had never learned. Alina blinked. For me, I'm told humans drink it, he said, trying for a lightness that didn't quite land. They sat in the small breakfast nook, instead of the formal dining room. The world outside the window turned the color of peaches, a softness San Francisco saved for those who waited long enough. Steam curled from 2 cups between them. For a few minutes, they said nothing. It wasn't the stiff quiet he was used to. It felt more like a bench at a station where trains arrive late and no one is angry about it. He cleared his throat. Earlier today, I saw a photo by accident. He watched her face change, then steady. Your brother. She set her cup down, fingers circling the porcelain like it held a pulse. Yes, he chose each word with care. Is he? On the spectrum, she said, a small smile, quick to rise, quicker to fade. We grew up in a house that didn't have a word for it. Just 1,000 small adjustments made with love and sometimes with fear, it explains. He stopped, searching the table for language. How you stand where storms don't knock you over. She breathed out. He taught me a different clock. There are days when progress is breathing twice, before the tears come. Days when progress is a single step that doesn't end in a fall. You learn to see the victories no one claps for. David looked at her and, to his surprise, didn't feel defensive. He felt relieved. Why do you keep trying? He asked, the question quiet as a confession. Because I know what it feels like to be unseen, Alina answered. She did not rush. When my brother was little, people spoke over him, around him, past him. It made him smaller. It also made me smaller, so I try until I am seen, and until he is seen. With Ethan, it's the same. He is not a problem to fix. He is a person to meet. A person to meet, he repeated, as if the phrase had a taste. He stared into his tea. I have been managing a schedule, not meeting a son. Schedules help, she said gently, but love is the room where the schedule happens. He almost laughed at the neatness of it. Almost, instead. Another memory came clear in that lemon-bright hospital room, whispering, when you don't know what to say, Neil. He felt the tenderness of it nick him from the inside. I don't know how to be what he needs, he admitted, each word an unbuttoning. Every time I reach, I feel like I'm pretending to be a man who knows what he's doing. Elena's gaze didn't flinch. Pretending to love is still love, Mr. Hale. The heart learns. Sometimes the hands know first. He looked up. You make it sound survivable. It is. She lifted her cup again. The worst days pass. The better ones arrive. We earn them by staying. He weighed that. In another life, the one measured by quarterly reports and clean exit staying was the opposite of strategy. Here, it was the only one. He softened without deciding to. Thank you for what you did last night. He swallowed. For what you do, full stop. You're welcome, she said simply. Then, after a beat, you don't have to trust me yet. Let the results persuade you. Let Ethan persuade you. The phrase landed with the same gentle authority her lullaby had carried. Let Ethan persuade you. He nodded, slow and honest. They found the boy in the living room, lining toy cars by shade silver, then blue bottled. Alina knelt a few feet away, palms open and empty, an invitation without pressure. Ethan glanced at David, then back at her. Something in his face loosened. He lifted his arms, not high, not emphatic, just enough to make the meaning clear to anyone who knew what to look for. He reached. It wasn't dramatic. It was better than that, deliberate. A request with no words. Addressed to the one person he trusted to understand without translation. David felt a flash of heat. Molasses. Old spark, but it didn't burn the same. Hope rose in the same breath and shouldered against it. His mind tried to turn the moment into a metric he could manage, but his heart would not let him. Alina gathered Ethan with practiced care, not clinging, not claiming. There you are, she murmured, as if she'd been waiting at a door he could open any time he chose. David stood by the archway, hands in his pockets, a man with two truths in his mouth and no room to say both at once. He watched his son settle, his breath find a calmer lane, the lines in his forehead ease their stubbornness. He was softening, he knew it. He also knew he might never admit it out loud in the same sentence as his gratitude. Not yet. Behind him, a late sun squared itself on the floorboards, drawing a bright line across the room. He stayed on his side of it for now, but he knew the line wasn't a wall. It was only light, and light moves. The bedroom door had not been opened in months. Dust lay across the handle like a warning, the kind that tells you you're trespassing. In your own house, David hesitated in the hallway, hand hovering over the knob. He had passed this room 100 times, always keeping his eyes forward. But tonight something drew him in. The storm had long since passed. The house was quiet, save for the muffled hum of the city beyond the windows. He pressed the knob slowly, the hinges groaning as if in protest. Claire's room, everything was where she had left it, as though she had stepped out and might return at any moment. Perfume bottles lined the dresser, their glass catching what little moonlight filtered in. Her scarves, neatly folded in the closet, still carried the faintest trace of lavender. Photographs on the nightstand framed smiles that time refused to release. Dofford stood in the doorway, chest tight. The air smelled like memory sweet and unbearable. He stepped forward, careful not to disturb anything, yet desperate for contact. A drawer in the nightstand sat slightly ajar. He frowned, pulling it open, half afraid of what he might find. Inside lay a single envelope, its paper yellowed faintly. His name scrawled across the front in Claire's looping handwriting. His breath caught. He sank onto the edge of the bed, the letter trembling in his hands. For a moment he couldn't bring himself to open it. Just the sight of her handwriting was enough to undo him. Finally, with shaking fingers, he broke the seal. "David," it began, her voice almost audible between the strokes of ink. "If you are reading this, I am already gone. I know you. I know how you will try to carry the world on your shoulders alone, how you will confuse strength with silence. Please, don't. Don't become a fortress. A fortress keeps danger out, but it keeps love out, too. Ethan needs more than your protection. He needs your presence, and he needs love, even if it doesn't come from you alone. Let him be loved, even by someone unexpected. Don't measure him by milestones. Measure him by moments. Let him laugh. Let him reach. Let him breathe." The words blurred. David pressed the paper to his chest, as if it might stitch back what had been torn from him. His body shook, grief breaking through the walls he had built. For the first time in years, he did not fight the tears. He let them come, silent and unrelenting. "I failed you," he whispered into the empty room. I failed him. The sound of his own voice startled him, as if confessing aloud made the guilt heavier. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the letter crushed in his grip. Claire had seen him even in her absence. She had known his weakness before he could admit it, and now her plea let him be loved to code, like a commandment he was afraid to obey. The house seemed to tilt around, him pressing its silence into his bones. He closed his eyes, whispering again, "I don't know how." On the other side of the house, in her small room tucked near the servants' wing, Alina sat beneath the dim glow of a bedside lamp. The rest of the house had gone to sleep. She should have been resting too, but the envelope on her lap refused to let her. She had unfolded the letter at least a dozen times already, smoothing the creases until the paper was weary in her hands. The logo at the top gleamed faintly in the light. St. Catherine's Academy for Special Education. Her eyes traced the words again. "We are deeply impressed by your experience and compassion. We would like to offer you a position with us. The role is stable, with full training and long-term security. We believe you could make a profound difference here." Her dream in black and white. The work she had once promised herself she would pursue, the chance to shape not just one child's world, but many. Her hand trembled as she placed the letter on the desk, then pulled out a blank sheet of paper. She began writing, "Thank you for the offer, but I must decline." The pen scratched only a few words before she stopped. She stared at the page, her heart twisting. Decline? Could she really? She crumpled the draft, tossed it into the wastebasket, and covered her face with both hands. Ethan's face rose before Hathaway. His small hands had reached for her. The sound of his fragile laugh when she played with him. She thought of the storm, his panic soothed only by her song. He needed her. Yet wasn't this what she had always wanted? To work in a place where children like her brother would not be invisible. To be more than someone's maid, more than someone filling a space until the next dismissal. She lit the lamp brighter, the light sharpening the room's corners. Her reflection in the small mirror looked older, burdened. She whispered into the silence, as if testing the truth out loud. Do I belong here, or out there? Her throat tightened. There was no answer, only the steady glow of the lamp, her hands shaking as she folded the letter back into its envelope. She slid it beneath her pillow, as though hiding it might quiet the war inside her. Her eyes lingered on the wastebasket, the crumpled rejection note staring back at her. She pressed her palms to her face, torn between duty and dream. Across the mansion, one man sat in his wife's untouched room, holding a letter that begged him to open his fortress. And in another, a woman sat with a different letter, torn between leaving and staying. Neither knew the other's struggle, but in the quiet hours of that night, both carried the same weight. The fear of letting go, the fear of choosing wrong, and the silent prayer that somehow love would show them the way. It began as a whimper, the kind a parent recognizes before sound has shape. By the time David reached the nursery, the whimper had become a cry that clawed at the walls. Ethan lay flushed and glassy-eyed, his little body trembling beneath the weighted blanket that usually settled him. When David lifted him, heat poured. Through the fabric like a warning, the boy's forehead burned against his cheek. His breaths were shallow, his skin hot and damp. "Mrs. Grant," David called, voice cracking. "Alina." Footsteps answered first, then the door. Alina came in, already rolling up her sleeves. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't need to. She touched Ethan's temple with the back of her hand, then reached for the digital thermometer on the dresser. The tiny beep came too quickly. David's mouth went dry. Is that dangerous?" "It's high," Alina said, calm in a way that felt impossible. "We'll bring it down." How the words shot out and shattered against the air. "Tell me what to do." "Dim the lights," she said, "and open the window an inch. Quiet helps." He fumbled with the lamp, hands useless for simple things, then cracked the window. Night air moved in, cool as a hand on a fevered brow. Alina folded a clean washcloth in thirds, soaked it in a bowl of lukewarm water, and wrung it until it dripped in a soft, deliberate rhythm. She laid it across Ethan's forehead, replaced it when it warmed, then again. Like a tide that never forgot the shore, David hovered, a man whose empire answered to his voice, and yet whose son did not. Do we call someone?" "I'll call the after-hours nurse," she said, already tapping the number saved in her phone. Her Spanish threaded softly under her breath as she listened and answered wait time, symptoms tidy facts in a storm. She ended the call and met David's eyes. They said acetaminophen by weight. "We have the liquid, I'll measure." His hands shook as he found the bottle in the drawer. The label swam. "What if I get it wrong?" "You won't," Alina said, measuring calmly, exact to the line. "You'll hold him while I give it." He swallowed. "I don't think he wants me." "Tonight he needs all of us," she replied, and there was a quiet mercy in it. "Sit." He sat in the rocking chair, and she placed Ethan carefully in his arms, the boy's heat blooming through David's shirt. Ethan whimpered, pushing against the new position, but Elena's voice steadied the room. "Slow breaths, Monsieur Lanslow." She slipped the dosing syringe between Ethan's cheek and gum, a practiced angle that avoided gag reflex. "Good job," she murmured, as if good job could be a blanket large enough to cover fear. She took the empty syringe back, then traded the damp cloth for a fresh one. "Sips?" she asked. David nodded, though his throat had closed to the width of a thread. They waited. Panic made a list. Love made a plan. Alina kept the rhythm cloth while David rocked a pace that matched no clock he'd ever obeyed. The fever didn't drop on command, it softened at the edges. Ethan's cries dulled from sharp to duller, from a blade to a heavy spoon. Claire, David whispered without meaning to. The name floated and fell. He felt absurd for saying it and wrecked for not saying it sooner. Alina heard and did not ask him to explain. She resumed the cool cloths, her movements gentle enough to pass for prayer. Minutes were longer than minutes. Sweat dampened Ethan's hairline. His lashes clumped. His hands trembled in small aftershocks. When he jerked, David flinched as if the tremor had come from his own bones. "I can't," he started, then broke. "I don't know how to reach him when he's scared." Elena's gaze was steady. "Then be there while he's scared," she said softly. "That's a kind of reaching." The sentence landed where advice becomes permission. He tightened his hold by a fraction, not to restrain but to tether. The fever's heat radiated, relentless. The room narrowed to the circle of light from a single lamp, a bowl, a cloth, a child's small sounds. The city slept beyond the glass. The house breathed in shallow pools. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Alina checked the thermometer again. The number had crept down, just enough to matter. "You're doing it," she told both of them. David nodded too hard, and something came unmoored inside him. He shifted Ethan to Alina and stood abruptly, as if verticality might hold him together. It didn't. He stumbled into the hallway, braced himself against the wall, and slid down until the floor accepted his weight. His elbows found his knees. His hands found his face. His breath found a raggedness he couldn't iron flat. "I'll never be enough for him," he said into his palms, the words scraping on their way out. He had said them once in his head 1,000 different ways. Saying them aloud cost more than any loss he'd tallied on paper. Footsteps, approach not hurried, not hesitant. Alina sat beside him, leaving a small space that meant respect before it meant comfort. She didn't speak. She didn't try to turn the sentence into something prettier than it was. She simply slid her hand into his, her fingers warm and present, and let silence do the repair language sometimes weakens. David kept his face covered, but he didn't pull away. He let her hand anchor his. He let the grief run its course without apology. The hallway was narrow enough to feel like confession, wide enough to hold them both. After a while he couldn't have said how long his breathing evened to something almost human. He lowered his hands. Elena's eyes were kind, not pitying. In the quiet, the walls no longer felt like judges. They felt like witnesses. "How do you do that?" he asked hoarsely. "What? Make it feel survivable," she considered, by not trying to skip to the part where it's already better. He laughed once, a sound that was half broken and half new. The fever of his own pride had broken, too. He could feel it, a heat leaving. "I didn't know it was allowed," he said. "To not know, it's required," Alina answered. "For most of us." They sat there, sharing a silence that held shape somewhere in the house. The heat clicked on. A pipe sighed and rested. The storm was only a rumor now. Alina squeezed his hand once, then rose. "I'll check him again." David stood too fast, swaying, then steadied. "Ethan." "You," he said, and it sounded to his own ears like language learning to walk. They re-entered the nursery. The lamp still cast its small circle. The bowl of water had cooled. Ethan lay against the crook of Elena's arm, breath slower, brow less fierce. His fingers, once fists, now found the edge of her sleeve and rested. There, not clinging so much as confirming. When she moved the cloth to his neck, he didn't flinch. David's shoulders dropped in a way they hadn't in months. He didn't reach to take Ethan, not yet. He didn't need to win the moment. He needed to witness it. "Can I sit?" he asked. Alina nodded toward the chair. "Sit, stay. That's the work." He obeyed. The rocker creaked once and then matched the tempo of the boy's breaths. Minutes fell like feathers, one after another. He watched the fever inch down from a peak to a ridge, from a ridge to a slope. Progress, in the wild, looks like this. Claire would have known what to do, he said. Not to be corrected, just to mark the truth. Maybe, Alina replied softly, eyes on Ethan. Or maybe she would have done what you're doing now. What's that? Refusing to leave. He took that in, let it move somewhere useful. In the quiet, he noticed a detail he might have missed any other night. Each time thunder had rumbled in recent weeks, Ethan's shoulders had leaped. Tonight they didn't. The air in the room felt less electric, more ordinary. The way a kitchen feels after you decide to wash the dishes. Instead of fearing the pile, Alina adjusted the blanket with a motion that wished no scene to be made of it. Ethan sighed, not in distress, but in the way a body chooses rest. The fever had not vanished, but it had lost its grip. David leaned forward, forearms on his knees, and let his hands hang open. "I was wrong," he said into the warm quiet, to no one and everyone, about what strength is. Alina didn't answer. She didn't need to. The room had heard Dot when Ethan finally dozed. It happened like weather, the heavy kind that breaks into rain and then into clear air. The boy's mouth softened, his breath lengthened. His hand loosened its hold on Elena's sleeve, only to find it again, lighter than before. The house, lately built of hard silences, softened with him. Corridors exhaled. Doors rested in there. Frames, the night held. David stayed in the chair. Alina stayed on the floor, back against the side of the crib. One arm curved in a shape the body remembers long after the mind forgets. Between them, not a word. Between them, more said than speech. It was the turning, not spectacular, not cinematic. Just two adults choosing the small courage of staying, while a child slept in the cradle of their choice. Outside, the city went on. Inside, the fever loosened its claim, and the house, at last, grew quiet, heavy with an understanding neither of them spoke, and both of them felt. The morning sun spilled across the nursery floor, cutting soft squares of gold that looked like stepping stones for someone small enough to use them. Toys lay scattered blocks in crooked towers, cars lined nose to nose, and a faded stuffed fox whose seams had grown weary but loyal. Alina sat cross-legged on the rug, the fox dangling from her hand. She gave it a playful shake and tapped it against her own head with a loud, exaggerated thunk. "Oh no," she gasped, widening her eyes in mock alarm. "The fox is clumsy today." Ethan watched, his small hands opening and closing in the air. His eyes, usually wary, always measuring the world for safety, were fixed on her. Waiting, she tried again, this time brushing the fox lightly against his arm and pulling it back with a squeaky ouch. Her voice carried a rhythm of mischief, soft but certain. She leaned closer. "Sold we tree again, mi cielo." For a moment nothing happened. Then just a sound, barely there, a short, uneven puff of air that left his mouth open in surprise. Alina froze. Her own breath caught afraid to scare it away. Was that? She whispered. The boy's lips trembled, his eyes wide. Then came another sound, louder this time, bouncing awkwardly into the room. A giggle. It cracked something open. Ethan's tiny chest shook as the laugh stumbled out, raw and unpolished, but real. His cheeks flushed pink. His small hands flapped once, then again, as if even his body didn't know how to contain this new thing bursting from inside him. Alina pressed a hand over her mouth, eyes stinging, then leaned into the moment. She made the fox stumble in circles, then let it trip dramatically onto its face. "Oh no," she cried, feigning despair. This time, Ethan's laugh tumbled out in full. A sound so unguarded, so alive, it seemed to reach corners of the house that hadn't heard joy in years. His giggles rose higher, bouncing into squeals, each one shaking his little frame as if laughter was something too big for him to hold. Elena's own laugh spilled over, soft but awed. She clapped once, softly, as if applause might sanctify the moment. "That's it, Ethan. Laugh. It's beautiful." From the doorway, David stood frozen. He hadn't meant to come in. He'd only wanted to check the room before his morning call. But the sound stopped him cold. He gripped the doorframe with both hands, his knuckles pale, his eyes burned. He had braced himself to never hear this sound, to accept silence and sobs as the only music his house would ever know. Yet here it was, unscripted, unpurchased, a laugh that carried no agenda except joy. His throat closed. The corners of his mouth trembled. Ethan, oblivious, pressed his face into the fox's fur, shaking with delight. His cheeks glowed red from the effort. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes from laughing too hard to new. The sound filled, every space overlapping itself, bouncing off walls, rushing through air like water finally freed from a blocked pipe. David pressed a fist against his mouth, willing himself not to break down in the threshold. But the tears came anyway, hot and unstoppable. He whispered into the wood, into the air, into the moment itself, "Thank you, Alina." The words escaped raw, jagged at the edges, but soaked with a gratitude so deep it frightened him. He had never said them like that before, not to anyone. Since Claire, Alina looked up then, startled, and saw him. For an instant she froze, unsure if she had overstepped again. But when her eyes found his face, she understood. She saw the wetness clinging to his lashes, the way his shoulders softened as if a weight had been knocked loose. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Instead, she guided the fox to tickle Ethan's belly. The boy squealed, his laughter higher. This time, his little body wriggling in delight. David stepped into the room, slowly, reverently, like a man entering a church. He lowered himself into the armchair by the window and let his head fall into his hands. He listened as, the room filled with something he had believed lost forever. He looked up, eyes blurry, and saw his son glowing with life. Ethan's tiny fists no longer clenched with fear. They reached forward, reaching for the fox, reaching for Alina, reaching for connection, for safety, for joy. David pressed his palms together, resting them against his lips, and allowed himself to weep, not with the bitterness of loss this time, but with the shock of hope. The silence that had haunted the Hale mansion cracked apart, like old plaster. The house, which had worn grief like a second skin, now vibrated with a sound that didn't belong to sorrow. It was lighter, freer, carrying through the corridors and into the heart of the man who had stopped believing. David whispered again, almost inaudible, to no one and everyone, "You're safe here, Ethan. You're safe." And in that moment, with laughter ricocheting off the walls and into his bones, he believed it. The Hale house breathed for the first time in years, and its breath was laughter. The living room was quiet that evening, save for the faint clatter of wooden blocks tumbling against each other. Ethan sat cross-legged on the rug, stacking and knocking them over with gleeful focus. Alina knelt beside him, her hair falling over her shoulder as she laughed softly at his persistence. David stood in the doorway, watching them. His tie hung loose around his neck, his briefcase forgotten by the front door. He should have felt peace at this sight, a house alive again, his son laughing, Alina steady beside him. But the unease pressed harder each day. He had noticed it in the smallest ways. Alina pausing mid-task, staring out the window longer than usual, her sighs quiet but heavy. At meals, her smile still came, but often with a shadow. She seemed present, in body, but part of her was elsewhere. David's chest tightened. He knew that look. It was the look of someone preparing to leave. He drew in a shaky breath, fists curling at his sides. All his life, he had spoken to boardrooms, investors, politicians, afraid of commanding the room. But this asking one woman to stay felt like scaling a mountain barefoot. Ethan clapped his hands suddenly, delighted at his tower collapsing. Alina joined his laughter, but David could hear the sigh woven into it. That was enough. He stepped into the room. His shoes made a soft sound against the hardwood, drawing both their eyes. "David?" Alina asked gently, surprised. He didn't answer at once. He lowered himself into the armchair across from them, elbows on his knees, head bowed. He rubbed his palms together as if coaxing words from the friction. Finally, his voice came, low, uneven. "You've been distant." Alina blinked, her hand still resting on Ethan's back. "I know, please." His eyes lifted, raw and unguarded. "Don't tell me it's nothing." Silence stretched, filled only by the sound of Ethan humming to himself. David's throat tightened. He leaned forward, every word pulled from somewhere deep. "If you're thinking of leaving, don't." Alina froze. The truth she hadn't spoken shimmered in her eyes. He pressed on, voice breaking. "Don't leave. Not as an employee. Not as a temporary solution I'll replace. When the contract ends, stay." His words faltered, then came back stronger, trembling with something that felt like prayer. "Stay as family." Ethan looked up, sensing the shift in the air. His little hands stilled on the blocks. Elena's lips parted, her breath catching. Tears welled as she shook her head slowly, not in refusal but disbelief. "David, I've built walls since Claire," he admitted, voice thick. "Walls, I told myself, were to protect Ethan, but they only kept him alone. And me, too." He swallowed hard, his eyes shining. "You tore through those walls without even trying. You gave him his first steps, his first calm night, his first laugh. You gave him back to me." He drew a sharp breath, chest aching. "Don't go, not because of duty, not because of pay. Stay because we need you, because I need you." The last words landed like stones rolling off a cliff. He had never said them aloud, not since Claire. Elena's tears spilled freely now. She looked at Ethan, who had leaned against her knee, his wide eyes searching hers. She brushed a hand through his hair, then looked back at David. Her voice shook, but every syllable carried truth. "I already stayed, David." He frowned faintly, unsure. Her tears fell harder, but her smile grew through them. "I stayed the First time Ethan reached for me. That moment, I knew I belonged. I wasn't here because of money or circumstance. I was here because love asked me to be. David's breath caught. He pressed his hand to his mouth, fighting the wave that rose inside him. Ethan suddenly crawled forward, tugging at Elena's arm, then at David's. His small voice, unformed but insistent, carried the weight of everything. Mama, Daddy. The sound fractured David. He dropped to the rug beside them, no longer able to keep distance. His arms went around Ethan, then around Elena, pulling them close. He buried his face in Ethan's hair, then against Elena's shoulder. For a long moment, the three of them stayed, there bound not by blood, but by something stronger. Ethan's small giggles rose again, muffled in the circle of arms. Elena's hand pressed against David's back, steady and sure. David whispered into the warmth of them both, his voice breaking but certain. We're a family now. Elena closed her eyes, tears still flowing, and answered softly, we always were. The house around them felt different, lighter, freer. The walls that had carried grief now carried laughter and promise. Silence, once heavy, had been broken for good, and in that embrace, under the soft hum of a child's joy, the Hale mansion finally became what it was meant to be, a home. The auditorium swelled with applause as names were called one by one, graduates crossing the stage in neat rows of caps and gowns. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, catching on tassels that swung like tiny pendulums, marking the end of years of work. Elena stood among them, her robe pressed, her mortarboard slightly askew from nerves. Her eyes shimmered as she clutched the program in her hands. She had spent years studying at night after Ethan fell asleep, waking before dawn to read textbooks in the quiet of the kitchen, memorizing lessons between therapy appointments and housework. Now, standing under the vaulted ceiling, she felt the weight of every sacrifice on the grace that had carried her here in the audience. David sat upright in a crisp suit, his hands folded tight until her name was near. Beside him, Ethan now, older, his hair neatly combed, held a large cardboard sign nearly too big for his little arms. In bold, colorful marker letters it read, "We love you, Mama." The moment Elena stepped forward, Ethan lifted the sign as high as he could, wobbling with determination. His cheeks flushed red, but his eyes shone with pride. Elena froze on the stage, diploma just placed in her hand. Her throat tightened as she spotted him, his small arms straining under the cardboard, his smile wide and certain. She pressed the diploma to her chest, tears streaming freely, unable to hide them even if she had wanted to. The applause grew louder, and above it all she could hear Ethan's small, clear voice calling, "Mama." David clapped until his palms stung, his own eyes wet but unashamed. For the first time in years, his pride was uncomplicated. He wasn't clapping for a flawless house or a business achievement. He was clapping for love, for the woman who had rebuilt their broken lives. That night the house felt different, as if it too had attended the ceremony. The walls seemed lighter, the rooms warmer, the air itself alive with laughter that lingered from their return. Ethan carried his sign everywhere, until bedtime, showing it to anyone who passed. Finally, he curled up on the couch between David and Elena, his eyelids heavy but his spirit restless. "Mama," he whispered, tugging her sleeve. "Sing the song." Elena smiled, brushing hair from his forehead. She began softly, the familiar Spanish lullaby flowing like water down familiar stones. The melody had carried him through fevers and fears, and now it carried him toward sleep. Her voice, though tired, was steady. Every note was woven with memory the night of the blackout. The evenings by candlelight, the battles with silence and sobs. Now, those same notes were colored with triumph. David sat back at first, listening, his heart tightening the way it always did when she sang. But something inside him stirred a memory of Claire, of the letter she had left, of her plea to let others love their son. He thought of all the nights he had stood in the doorway, silent and invisible. Tonight, he chose differently. He leaned forward, his deep voice blending, uncertain at first, but steadying as he went. Alina glanced at him in surprise. Her smile widened, her tone lifting to meet his. Together, their voices wrapped around Ethan, like a quilt stitched from patience and trust. Ethan blinked up at them, a grin spreading as his hands flapped with excitement. "Sing louder, Dad," he urged, his voice bright and insistent. David chuckled through the lump in his throat and raised his volume, no longer afraid of being heard. Their harmony filled the room, rough and smooth, strong and tender, the sound of a house alive again. Ethan's laughter bubbled through the melody, blending with their song. Slowly, he laid his head against Elena's shoulder, eyes closing, breath evening into the rhythm of peace. David wrapped an arm around them both, his hand resting over Elena's. He felt the weight of all they had endured and the lightness of where they had arrived. For the first time, silence in the house was not heavy, was sacred. The Hale mansion no longer stood as a monument to grief. Its rooms hummed with a new kind of energy, footsteps running down hallways, laughter echoing off walls, a lullaby that refused to fade. As the last notes drifted into quiet, David whispered what had been true all along. "We're a family, always." And in that quiet, the house itself seemed to sigh in agreement.